The lights went out first. Then came the scream. Chinedu stood frozen in the doorway of the room. His father had kept locked for 30 years, his flashlight shaking in his hand, his heart slamming against his ribs like it wanted to escape his chest. Behind him, footsteps. Someone else was in the house. 3 days earlier, none of this had made any sense. 3 days earlier, Chinedu had simply been a grieving son sitting in a lawyer's office, holding a small brass key, while his two older brothers laughed in his face. Laughed. Not cried, not mourned. Laughed. Their father, Chief Chukwudi Eze, one of the wealthiest men in Lagos, had been buried only 3 days before. And now his three sons sat together in the family lawyer's office for the reading of his will, the air thick with grief and something colder greed, waiting patiently in the corner of the room, like a fourth brother nobody wanted to acknowledge. Emeka, the eldest, sat with his legs crossed, his tailored suit immaculate, his face already rehearsing the expression of a man about to inherit an empire. Ikenna, the second son, sat quietly beside him, calculating, always calculating, his eyes flicking between the lawyer's folder and his brother's face. And Chinedu, the youngest, sat a little apart from them both, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes red from nights of sleeplessness at his father's bedside. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began to read. To my eldest son, Emeka Chukwudi Eze, I leave the company, the Victoria Island headquarters, and all commercial vehicles owned under Eze Holdings. Emeka's chest swelled. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. His mother, seated behind him, nodded with pride. To my second son, Ikenna Chukwudi Eze, I leave the Lekki properties, the family farmland, 6 rental buildings, and the investment accounts listed under my personal estate. Ikenna exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders melting into quiet triumph. He glanced at his brother. Emeka glanced back. Between them passed a silent understanding they had won. Then the lawyer paused. He looked up, and his eyes moved toward the quiet one. The son who had never once, in 31 years, asked his father for money. The son who had slept upright in a plastic hospital chair for 6 months so his father wouldn't wake up alone. The son everyone in that room had quietly forgotten to watch. To my youngest son, Chinedu, the lawyer said, his voice lower now, almost reluctant, I leave the old house on Thomas Street, Lagos Island. Silence swallowed the room whole. Then Emeka broke it with a laugh, loud, careless, cruel. Thomas Street? He repeated, as if the words tasted strange in his mouth. That old, condemned thing? Ikenna covered his mouth, but his shoulders were already shaking with laughter he didn't bother to hide. Father left us a company and an empire, Ikenna said, and gave Chinedu a house with a leaking roof and cracked walls. Someone near the back of the room chuckled along, not wanting to be left out of the joke. Chinedu said nothing. He looked down at the old brass key resting in the envelope on his lap, its metal dark with age, and he said absolutely nothing. That was when the lawyer cleared his throat and lifted one final sheet of paper. There is a condition attached to this inheritance. The laughter stopped as if someone had cut a wire. Chief Eze has instructed that Chinedu must not sell, demolish, renovate, or transfer ownership of the house until he has spent 7 consecutive nights inside it. Emeka's smile fell away. 7 nights? Is this a joke? It is not, the lawyer said. And on the 7th night, Chinedu is required to open the room at the rear of the house. Ikenna frowned. What room? The lawyer looked directly at Chinedu, and for the first time that morning, his voice trembled. The room your father kept locked for more than 30 years. Chinedu's fingers closed around the key until his knuckles whitened. The lawyer read the final line of the will, and those 11 words would go on to shatter everything the 3 brothers believed about their father, about their family, and about each other. Everything your father wants you to know is inside that room. Nobody in the room was laughing anymore. There are some things money cannot buy, and some truths that money spends a lifetime trying to bury. Chief Chukwudi Eze had spent 30 years building an empire out of nothing. A construction company with offices on Victoria Island, warehouses stretching along the Lekki corridor, apartments across Lagos Island, and a waterfront property on Banana Island that people whispered about at parties they weren't invited to. To the world, Chief Eze had lived the kind of life other men only dreamed about. but he was dead now. And the greatest thing he had ever built wasn't sitting in a bank account or a property portfolio. It was locked behind a door on Thomas Street, waiting for the one son who had never once asked him for anything. Why had he given the company to Emeka? Why had he given the land to Ikenna? And why, of all three sons, had he handed the truth to the boy nobody expected? To understand any of it, you have to go back. Back before the mansion in Ikoyi, back before the private drivers and the marble floors and the swimming pool that seemed to announce success to anyone who passed the gate. Back to when Chukwudi Eze was simply a young man from the southeast trying to survive in a city that swallowed dreamers whole. He arrived in Lagos with almost nothing. He sold electrical equipment out of a wheelbarrow before he could afford a shop. He transported goods across the city on the back of a borrowed truck. Some months he barely scraped together enough for rent, and he slept in a small, leaking house on Lagos Island that would, decades later, become the very property his sons laughed at in a lawyer's office. Back then, there was nothing luxurious about that house. The walls were cracked, the roof groaned every time Lagos rain came down hard. But to young Chukwudi, that house meant survival. It was where he built his first business from a single wooden table. It was where he married the woman he loved. It was where his first son, Emeka, took his first breath. Emeka grew up wanting everything his father hadn't had: expensive things, respect, the kind of presence that made a room go quiet when he walked in. Chukwudi loved him fiercely, but there were nights he lay awake worrying about the hunger in his eldest son's eyes. Then came Ikenna, quieter, sharper, a boy who learned early that silence could be more powerful than shouting, that watching people closely could tell you more than asking them questions ever would. And then, years later, came Chinedu, and everything about the family changed the moment he arrived. Chinedu never cared for expensive clothes or flashy cars. He cared about sitting beside his father while he worked late into the night, watching him sketch out business plans by lantern light. When Chukwudi came home exhausted, dust on his shoes and worry etched into his face, it was Chinedu who ran to the door first. "Papa, you're back." And something in Chukwudi's chest would loosen every single time. As the business grew, one delivery contract becoming five becoming 20, until Chukwudi finally broke into construction and began acquiring land across Victoria Island and Lekki, and eventually, Ikoyi, the family's fortunes transformed completely. People who had once looked past him on the street now bowed their heads and called him chief. He moved his family into a mansion with security at the gate and cars lined up in the driveway like a private showroom, but he never sold the old house. "Papa, why do you keep that place?" Emeka asked once, disgust barely hidden beneath his curiosity. "We don't need it anymore." "Because it belongs to our story," his father answered quietly. Emeka scoffed and gestured toward the mansion around them. "Our story is here now, Papa." Chukwudi only smiled a small, private smile that none of his sons understood. Ikenna tried a different approach years later. "That house could fetch a good price, Papa. Why hold on to something worthless?" "I know it's worth," Chukwudi said, "and it has nothing to do with money." Ikenna didn't understand. Chinedu thought he did. He was wrong, but not in the way anyone expected. As the brothers grew into men, the distance between them widened. Emeka threw himself into the company, chasing bigger deals, faster growth, louder success, dining in restaurants where a single meal cost more than most families earned in a month. Ikenna poured himself into property, always calculating, always expanding, always hungry for more land, more buildings, more proof that he mattered. Chinedu walked away from all of it. He built a small, modest business of his own. He lived simply, and when his father's body finally began to betray him, the trembling hands, the forgotten names, the long silences at dinner, it was Chinedu who noticed first. Chinedu, who sat across the table and watched his father's spoon slip from his fingers and clatter against the plate. He rushed him to the hospital that same night. The diagnosis, when it came, hit like a slow collapsing wall. Serious, progressive, treatable perhaps, for a while, but never curable. There were medications, there were specialists, there were no guarantees. Emeka visited when his schedule allowed. Ikenna visited between property inspections, but Chinedu stayed. For 6 long months, he sat in that hospital room, holding his father's hand, listening to him drift in and out of memories he had never shared with anyone. One night, as rain lashed against the hospital windows, Chief Eze gripped his youngest son's hand with surprising strength. "Chinedu." "Yes, Papa." "If I d. Don't say that." His father smiled faintly. Everybody dies, my son. He squeezed Chinedu's hand tighter. When that day comes, your brothers will believe they've received the greatest part of me. Chinedu frowned. What do you mean, Papa? You will understand. Papa, please tell me what you're talking about. His father turned his face toward the rain-streaked window and said nothing more for a long moment. Then, so quietly Chinedu almost missed it, he spoke 6 words that would haunt his son for months. Never sell the old house. 3 months later, Chief Chukwudi Eze was gone. Lagos mourned a legend. Business associates flew in for the funeral. Politicians sent wreaths. The mansion overflowed with mourners for days. But grief, as it always does, eventually gave way to something far less noble, the will. Emeka expected the company. Ikenna expected the properties. Chinedu, having never once discussed inheritance with his father, expected nothing at all. And that morning in the lawyer's office, nothing was exactly what everyone assumed he'd received. When his brothers laughed at him when Emeka leaned over and sneered, "You always were father's favorite. Look at your reward," when Ikenna smirked and muttered something about ghosts haunting an old, worthless house. Chinedu simply looked down at the brass key and remembered his father's final words. Never sell the old house. Then the lawyer handed him a sealed envelope. On the front, in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words. For Chinedu, open only after burial. With trembling fingers, Chinedu tore it open. Inside was a single sentence that stole the air from his lungs. Your brothers have received what they think they wanted. You have received what I needed you to find. He looked up. For the first time all morning, the smugness drained completely from Emeka's face. That evening, Chinedu drove alone to Lagos Island. The streets pulsed with the usual chaos, Danfo buses honking, hawkers weaving between cars, generators humming behind shuttered shop fronts. And there, tucked between 2 newer buildings, stood the house nobody wanted. The house his brothers had mocked. The house his father had refused to sell for 30 years. He unlocked the door. The hinges groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Dust hung thick in the beam of his flashlight. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, everyone knew that. So when he reached the back hallway and found the locked door his father had warned him about, and pressed his palm flat against its cold wooden surface, he had no explanation for what happened next. A small metal plate beside the handle bore a single engraved number. 7. 7 nights. 7 days. Was this simply a test his father had designed to teach him patience? Or had Chief Eze known something none of them could have imagined? Then Chinedu heard it. A faint metallic click from somewhere inside the locked room. He froze. He pressed his ear to the door and held his breath. Nothing. He stepped back and the click came again, sharper this time. Something was moving on the other side of that door. His hand had barely closed around the doorknob when every light in the house surged on at once, flooding the dead hallway in a harsh electric glow. He staggered backward, heart hammering. The power had been disconnected for years, yet every bulb in that house now burned bright. And from somewhere deep inside the locked room, a phone or something like one began to ring. If you're still watching up to now, type "I'm still here" in the comment section. The ringing stopped as suddenly as it began, and the house fell into a silence so complete that Chinedu could hear his own pulse in his ears. He didn't sleep that first night. He sat upright in the living room until dawn broke over Lagos Island, refusing to close his eyes even for a moment. On the second day, exhaustion finally softened into curiosity, and he began going through the old photographs scattered across the house. His father as a young man, thinner, hungrier-eyed, his parents on their wedding day, the house itself, freshly built, gleaming with a coat of paint that had long since faded. Then he found a photograph he had never seen before. His father, younger than he'd ever known him, stood beside another man, a man whose face tugged uncomfortably at Chinedu's memory. He studied it for a long moment before recognition hit him like a slap. It was Mr. Okafor, a senior executive who had worked closely with his father decades earlier, a name Chinedu had heard mentioned only in passing, usually followed by an uncomfortable silence. Behind the photograph, in faded ink, was a date, 31 years earlier. Why had his father been photographed with this man at the old house, 3 decades before Chinedu was even born? Digging further, he found a wooden box hidden behind a warped cabinet, old receipts, yellowed contracts, handwritten notes in his father's careful script, and a small, unmarked key that fit no lock he could find. That afternoon, his phone rang. Emeka, have you gone to see your new mansion yet? His brother asked, sarcasm dripping from every word. Chinedu said nothing. Emeka laughed. You should sell that place before the government condemns it, and you're left with nothing at all. Why do you even care? Chinedu asked, an edge creeping into his voice for the first time. There was a pause on the line, a pause that lasted a beat too long. I don't, Emeka finally said. But he did. Because something about their father's will had been gnawing at him since the moment the lawyer closed his folder. Why had their father divided everything so cleanly, so deliberately? Why had he demanded 7 nights and a locked room and a condition no ordinary inheritance required? Emeka began making calls to the family lawyer, who refused to say a word, and to old business associates of his father's, none of whom answered. His suspicion hardened into something close to obsession. On the 3rd night, Chinedu found a second letter, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the back hallway, his father's handwriting again, but shakier this time, as if written near the end. Chinedu, if you are reading this, then you have already begun to understand. Your brothers will not understand why I divided my estate this way. Do not blame them. They have spent their lives measuring success differently than you do. But there is something you must know. The house was built for a reason. Chinedu read on, his hands trembling. Many years ago, before you were born, I lost almost everything. He stopped. His father had never once, in 31 years, mentioned losing everything. There was a man I trusted, the letter continued. I believed he was my friend. I gave him access to my business. I trusted him with money. I trusted him with records. I trusted him with my family. Chinedu's pulse quickened, and he betrayed me. A sound cut through the silence of the house, a floorboard creaking in the hallway outside. Chinedu snapped off his flashlight and went still. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone was inside the house with him. He pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing, as the footsteps drew closer to the room he was hiding in. A shadow slid beneath the doorframe and stopped. The doorknob turned once, twice. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps retreated, fading back down the hallway until the house swallowed them whole. Chinedu didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally found the courage to check his phone, his hands were still shaking. He called Emeka, no answer. He called Ikenna, no answer either. The next morning, he discovered that one of the letters, a page he'd left on the wooden table the night before, had vanished completely. Someone had broken into the house. And whoever it was hadn't been searching randomly. They had known exactly what they were looking for. Rattled and desperate for answers, Chinedu drove across town to see Mama Ngozi, an elderly family friend who had known his father since long before the wealth, long before the mansion, long before anyone called him chief. At first, she refused to say a single word. But the moment Chinedu mentioned the name Okafor, her entire face changed. You found it, she whispered. Found what? The truth. She lowered herself slowly into a chair, her eyes distant. Your father never told you? No, she sighed, a long, weary sound. Then he wanted you to discover it yourself. She told him everything, how, 30 years earlier, his father had secured a contract that should have made his career, only to watch millions of naira vanish overnight. Documents manipulated, money quietly rerouted. And his father left holding the blame, his reputation nearly destroyed before it had truly begun. But he didn't do it, Chinedu said. It wasn't a question. No, Mama Ngozi said firmly. He didn't. Then who did? Your father's closest business partner, Okafor. She nodded slowly. Your father found proof, real proof. He could have destroyed the man. So why didn't he? Mama Ngozi's eyes filled with something like sorrow. Because the betrayal went deeper than business, Chinedu. Much deeper. What does that mean? She hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. Someone in your father's own family was involved. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Who? Chinedu asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mama Ngozi shook her head. Your father never told me the name, only that it broke something in him that never fully healed. That night, Chinedu drove back to Thomas Street with his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The 7th night was almost here, and he could feel the truth closing in around him like the walls of the old house itself. He searched the locked room again, running his hands along every surface, until he noticed something he'd missed before a wooden shelf that didn't quite sit flush against the wall. Behind it, a thin metal plate. He pressed it, and with a groan of old hinges, the wall shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside sat a small cassette recorder, and beside it, one final envelope, on the front, in his father's unmistakable hand. When all three of my sons are old enough to understand. His fingers shook as he inserted the cassette and pressed play. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then, his father's voice, older, weaker than Chinedu remembered, but unmistakably his. Chinedu, if you are hearing this, then you have found the room. A long, heavy pause. I need you to hear the truth from me. Chinedu leaned in so close, his forehead nearly touched the recorder. When my business was almost destroyed, his father's voice continued, the person who betrayed me was not only my business partner. Another pause, longer, heavier than the first. He was someone I trusted like a brother. Chinedu's breath caught in his throat. Your mother's brother. Chinedu clapped a hand over his mouth. His uncle, the man who had attended every wedding, every birthday, every funeral in the family, for as long as Chinedu could remember. The man who had once bounced him on his knee as an infant. That man, his father's voice pressed on, unwavering now, as if he'd waited 30 years to finally say these words aloud. He stole from the business and used my name to cover his tracks. But when I uncovered the truth, I realized something far worse. He had used information from inside my own family to do it. Chinedu's chest tightened. Your two older brothers were only children then. They knew nothing. But someone had used their names on falsified documents. Chinedu paused the recording, his mind racing to catch up with what he'd just heard. Suddenly, the will made a terrible, aching kind of sense. His father hadn't given Emeka and Ikenna the company and the properties because he loved them more. He had given them the visible wealth precisely so the truth could remain separate, protected, untouched, waiting for the one son who would know what to do with it. He pressed play again. His father's voice had softened. I knew that if I died without explaining any of this, my sons might tear each other apart fighting over money that was never the real inheritance at all. So I made one final decision. The company would go to Emeka. The land would go to Ikenna. And the truth would go to you. Tears blurred Chinedu's vision. Not because I love you more, Chinedu, but because you are the son who never once asked me what I owned. You only ever asked me how I was. The recording fell silent for a moment before his father's voice returned one final time, steady and certain. The old house holds the original documents, proof of everything that happened, papers that could destroy the people who betrayed me. But I did not keep them for revenge. I kept them so that one day my sons might understand why I made the choices I made. Then came the words that would echo in Chinedu's mind for the rest of his life. If your brothers ever come looking for this truth, give it to them. Do not use it to destroy them. Use it to save them. The recording clicked off. Chinedu sat alone in the darkness of the room his father had guarded for 30 years, and for the first time since the funeral, he finally understood everything. The old house had never been the smallest inheritance. It had been the heaviest one, carrying not gold or land, but the truth the entire family had been built on top of without ever knowing it. The next morning, headlights swept across the front of the house. Emeka and Ikenna climbed out of their cars, faces tight with anger and something close to desperation. We know father hid something here, Emeka said, storming up the cracked front steps. Chinedu met him in the doorway, calm in a way that unsettled his brother more than any argument could have. So that's why you came. Ikenna hung back, unable to meet his younger brother's eyes. Whatever is in this house, Emeka said, jaw tight, belongs to this family. No, Chinedu said quietly. It belongs to the truth. He led them to the hidden compartment and laid the documents out on the old wooden table, the falsified papers, the buried evidence, the names that had haunted their father for 3 decades in silence. Emeka read the first page, his face drained of color. Ikenna picked up another, then another, his hands beginning to tremble as the weight of it settled over him. Slowly, painfully, the truth dismantled every assumption they had carried since the reading of the will. Their father hadn't cheated them. He hadn't loved them any less than he loved Chinedu. He had simply understood them, understood that they were ready for wealth, but not yet ready for a burden this heavy. For a long moment, none of the 3 brothers spoke. For the first time since their father's death, nobody in that house was laughing. Emeka finally looked up, his voice raw. I was wrong. Chinedu said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Ikenna's eyes filled with tears he didn't bother to hide. Why didn't he just tell us himself? Chinedu looked around at the cracked walls, the faded photographs, the house that had somehow held an entire family's history inside its bones. Maybe, he said softly. He knew we wouldn't have listened. Months passed. The old house on Thomas Street changed slowly, deliberately, the way healing always does. Chinedu repaired the roof that had leaked for 30 years. He restored the walls his father had refused to abandon. He preserved every photograph, every letter, every fragile piece of a story that had nearly been lost. One room became a small family archive, a place where the truth would never again have to hide behind a locked door. The house stood now not as a monument to the money his father had made, but to the man he had been before any of it, the young hustler with nothing but a wheelbarrow and a will strong enough to survive Lagos. Emeka kept running the company, but something in him had shifted. He grew slower to judge, quicker to listen, the sharp edges of his ambition softened just slightly by everything he now understood. Ikenna began managing the family's properties with a different kind of care, no longer chasing more for the sake of having more. And for the first time in years, the three brothers began behaving like brothers again. Because sometimes a father doesn't leave his children the same inheritance. He leaves each child exactly what he believes they're ready to carry. Emeka received responsibility. Ikenna received opportunity. But Chinedu received the truth, and perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest inheritance of all. Money can disappear, buildings can collapse, businesses can fail. Land can be sold to the highest bidder and forgotten within a generation. But knowing where you came from, knowing what your family survived, knowing the quiet sacrifices made before you were even born, that is something no bank in Lagos could ever measure. And that is why, when everyone laughed at Chinedu for inheriting the old house, his father was, without question, the only person in that room who was smiling. Because Chinedu hadn't inherited the least. He had inherited what mattered most. Sometimes the smallest key opens the biggest door. And sometimes the thing everyone calls worthless is the very thing someone spent an entire lifetime protecting. So let me ask you, if you were one of those three brothers, would you have accepted your inheritance without asking a single question? Or would you have unlocked the old house and searched for everything your father left behind? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story touched something in you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next cinematic story filled with family secrets, mystery, wisdom, betrayal, and lessons that stay with you long after the story ends. Because sometimes, the greatest treasure isn't what a father leaves in your hands. It's what he leaves in your heart.